I was expecting a package. That is the only reason I opened the door without checking first, because the tracking notification said delivered by 7, and it was 6:53, and I had been waiting 3 days for that order. So when the knock came, I dried my hands on the dish towel, crossed the living room, and pulled the door open without a second thought. Imara and Estelle Cross were standing in my doorway in evening clothes. No call ahead, no text, just the two of them, composed, deliberate, and dressed like they had somewhere important to be after this. I read the room in the space of one breath. I stepped back and let them in. I did not offer warmth, and I did not offer an explanation for the absence of it. I simply moved to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and set it on the burner, asked if either of them wanted water. Estelle declined with her hand. Imara shook her head without looking at me. I kept my back to them for exactly long enough to slide open my voice memo app, press record, and set the phone face up on the counter where the acoustics were clean and the angle was natural. 17 years of business meetings taught me one thing above everything else. You record first, and you ask questions later. My name is Perline Bass. I am 61 years old. I built a property management portfolio and a construction company in Southwest Atlanta from 3 rental units and a grief I did not have time to sit inside. I have signed contracts, terminated partnerships, and restructured agreements across a boardroom table with people who believed my composure meant I was not paying attention. Every single one of them was wrong. I turned back around and leaned against the counter with my hands folded. Estelle began. She was measured, rehearsed, almost gentle, the way a person is gentle when they have practiced the tone, but not the mercy behind it. She used the word boundaries 4 times in the first 6 minutes, framed everything as healthy transitions, natural restructuring, the appropriate evolution of a mother's role once her son becomes a husband. She spoke about Coswell the way people speak about an asset being transferred, carefully, with language designed to sound reasonable to anyone who might be listening. Imara spoke twice. The first time about joint decision-making going forward. No outside input on matters that belong to their household. The second time, she used my first name. Not Miss Bass. Not anything that acknowledged 17 years of what I built or who I was in my son's life. Just Perline, flat and deliberate, like a door being closed from the other side. Before I tell you what happened next, if you are watching this right now, drop your location in the comments. I want to know what time it is, where you are, and whether you would have kept your composure standing in that kitchen. I said very little. I studied them both. Estelle did most of the talking for another 9 minutes. The business surfaced gradually. My operational role inside Bass built, my daily access to Coswell's schedule, my position relative to the life Imara intended to build. Nothing stated crudely. Everything stated with the precision of a woman who had rehearsed this in a mirror. At the door, Estelle paused and turned back. "After tomorrow," she said, "you're no longer family. You're just his mother." They left. I closed the door, sat in Raymond's chair, pressed stop. I sat there for 11 minutes watching the clock without meaning to. Then I opened Coswell's name in my phone, attached the file, typed nothing, and sent it at 9:47. He read it almost immediately. 3 dots appeared, disappeared. Nothing came. I set the phone face down on Raymond's armrest and did not touch it again that night. Coswell's silence followed me all the way to Stonecrest. I dressed that morning the way I dress for anything requiring me to hold myself together in public. Carefully, deliberately, with the kind of attention that keeps your hands occupied, so your mind does not wander somewhere dangerous. I arrived at the venue at 10:40 and took my seat near the aisle on the groom's side, close enough to see everything. far enough back to disappear if I needed to. The venue was beautiful. I will give Estelle that much. Ivory chair dressings tied with cream ribbon, white roses spilling from low centerpieces, a live band running a soft sound check near the far wall, 2 coordinators moving briskly between rows with clipboards and headsets, a photographer already circling the room collecting the before. Estelle stood near the entrance, greeting guests with both hands, and the broad composure of a woman who believed the day already belonged to her. I watched her work the room and said nothing. All morning, 3 memories kept returning, whether I invited them or not. The first was a dinner at Coswell's townhouse 14 months earlier. Small gathering. Easy conversation. Imara mentioned a contractor decision connected to Bass Built, as though the outcome had already been settled privately beforehand. Coswell went quiet for half a beat, lifted his glass, changed the subject smoothly enough that only somebody watching closely would notice. I noticed. The second memory came from a Sunday gathering at my sister's home the previous spring. Imara told 2 women near the kitchen that Coswell preferred to keep family time more contained these days. Pleasant tone, small smile, the careful language people use while establishing boundaries they have not officially announced yet. Coswell was in the next room. He did not correct it. The third memory unsettled me most. A contractor called me directly about material figures tied to a Bass-built project I had not even been briefed on yet. When I later mentioned the numbers to Coswell, genuine surprise crossed his face before he covered it. I understood then information was leaving our business through channels neither of us had approved. I was still sitting with those memories when Coswell walked through the venue doors at 11:15. Charcoal suit, no boutonniere, no groomsman beside him. A conversation near the entrance stopped halfway through a laugh when people realized he arrived alone. He paused at the guest registry table, picked up the pen, and signed his name in the deliberate handwriting Raymond passed down to him. The kind that takes its time because it means what it says. Then he turned toward the seating area. Not the preparation suite, not the groom's room upstairs, the seating. He walked calmly to the 3rd row and sat down on the groom's side with both hands folded in his lap. I stopped breathing for a moment. One of the coordinators immediately crossed the room toward him, wearing the fixed smile professionals use when something has shifted unexpectedly, but they are trying not to alarm guests. She bent down beside him. He answered quietly. Whatever he said made the smile disappear from her face before she straightened and walked quickly toward the pastor. The whispers started within minutes. The best man reached him first. Conversation brief. Tense shoulders. No visible argument. But when the best man stepped away, he dragged one hand across his mouth like somebody trying to process information too quickly. The groomsmen gathered near the back wall. Guests began turning in their seats. Near the front, Estelle's smile tightened for the first time all morning. I learned later Coswell had texted Imara before sunrise asking to speak privately before the ceremony. Imara had left her phone with the bridal party while hair and makeup rotated through the suite upstairs. Estelle saw the message first when one of the bridesmaids handed her the phone, thinking it might be wedding-related. Imara never saw it. One more calculation. One more thing Estelle would later regret. Upstairs, the first report was dismissed entirely. Then a bridesmaid returned pale and unable to explain properly what she had just seen downstairs. The hallway outside the bridal suite went silent, and Imara slowly rose from the makeup chair. He stood when the murmuring reached its peak. I watched Coswell rise from the 3rd row with the measured stride I recognized from every boardroom negotiation we had ever sat through together. Not rushed, not hesitant. The walk of a man who had already finished the argument inside himself and was simply arriving at the conclusion. The pastor stepped slightly aside without being asked. The band stopped mid-note so abruptly the keyboard player hit a wrong chord trying to pull back. 220 people turned in their seats at once, and the room shifted into the specific kind of silence that happens when everyone understands simultaneously that something irreversible is about to occur. A bridesmaid appeared halfway down the staircase, leading from the upper suite, paused when she saw Coswell at the altar alone, then turned and hurried back upstairs without saying a word. Coswell stood at the front and did not perform a single second of what followed. He said he owed everyone an honest minute before they gave more of their day to a ceremony he could not in good conscience continue. He said it plainly, no trembling, no dramatic pause. Just a man standing in a room full of people telling the truth at considerable personal cost. Near the second row, somebody whispered, "Oh my God," under their breath. Another guest shushed them immediately. He said he had learned something the night before that changed his understanding of the life he was preparing to walk into. Not a rumor. Not a misunderstanding. Something documented and clear that removed every reason he had left to proceed. Then he said something that made the room go still in a different way. He said, "This is not about one night. One night simply made it impossible to pretend I had not already seen enough." At the back of the room, Estelle stood up so quickly her chair legs scraped against the floor. For one brief moment, I thought she was going to walk toward him. Instead, she stopped herself, one hand gripping the edge of the aisle chair hard enough that even from where I sat, I could see the tension in her fingers. Nobody else moved. Coswell said marriage could not be built on a foundation where loyalty and authority were already being negotiated before vows were spoken. He said he loved Imara, said it plainly without decoration, the way a person says something true that costs them, and that loving her made the decision harder, not easier, which was exactly how he knew the decision was real. The wedding coordinator took 2 anxious steps toward the pastor, like she intended to interrupt, then stopped when the pastor gave a small shake of his head. Coswell thanked the pastor, thanked every person in that room for their time, their presence, and their expense, apologized that he could not offer them a different answer. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. The room stopped breathing. He walked to the altar rail and placed the engagement ring on the wood. Not handed back. Not thrown. Placed. With the deliberate care of a man setting something down for the last time and wanting to do it right. The photographer lowered his camera. Upstairs, a door slammed open hard enough for the sound to carry faintly into the ballroom. That was the moment the title promised. I had come in through the side door moments before he finished. I did not know he was going to do this. I had dressed that morning and driven to Stonecrest believing I was attending my son's wedding. When our eyes met across that room, he gave one small nod. The same nod Raymond used to give me across a table when a decision had already been made, and the only thing left was to stand behind it. Then he walked out through the side doors. I followed him into the parking lot. He stood beside his truck with his back to the building, shoulders set, facing the tree line at the far edge of the lot. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Then from somewhere inside the venue came the muffled sound of raised voices. Coswell closed his eyes briefly. The morning air settled still around us. He said, "I kept hoping you misheard what they meant." I put my hand on his arm and left it there. My phone started before I reached the car. Not Coswell, not family. The first message came from a woman I had not spoken to in 14 months, a church acquaintance who signed her text with a prayer emoji and the words, "Just checking on you." The second came from a contractor's wife I knew peripherally through a developer event 2 years earlier. The third was from my cousin in Decatur, who had not called me on my birthday in 3 years. All of them phrased as concern. All of them already carrying a version of events that had not come from me. I sat in my car in the Stonecrest parking lot, reading each message without responding. Coswell had already driven away. The venue doors were still closed behind me. The flowers inside had not even begun to wilt, and Estelle Cross had already started shaping the story. I understood then what I was dealing with. This was not a grieving mother reacting emotionally in the aftermath of humiliation. This was a prepared woman executing a response she had already imagined before the ceremony collapsed. By early afternoon, the shape of Estelle's version had reached me through 4 separate channels. The story was clean and consistent, too clean for something assembled in grief. Perline Bass was possessive, controlling, a woman incapable of releasing her son into his own life. The wedding had not collapsed because of anything Estelle or Imara did. It collapsed because a manipulative mother poisoned a 4-year relationship from the inside and finally succeeded the night before the ceremony. Nothing she said was technically actionable. No direct accusations, no profanity, no threats. Just careful atmospheric reframing delivered through trusted people to other trusted people who did not know me well enough to challenge it confidently. She selected her distribution network intelligently, people adjacent enough to matter, distant enough from me that her version arrived before my character did. Not everyone accepted it. Some people went quiet in the specific way that means they are waiting for more information before deciding what they believe. A few reached out privately in tones that told me they did not fully trust what they were hearing. But enough people absorbed Estelle's version that my phone began carrying a texture I recognized immediately. The texture of conversations where concern arrives already leaning toward judgment. Around 5 o'clock, I stopped at a grocery store near Camp Creek on my way home. Halfway down the produce aisle, I heard my name spoken softly behind me, followed by a sentence that cut off the second I turned around. The 2 women standing there smiled too quickly. One asked how I was holding up in the tone people use when they already think they understand the answer. I said I was fine. Neither woman held eye contact for very long after that. That moment bothered me more than the messages. Not because they believed Estelle completely, because doubt had already entered the room ahead of me. Imara stayed quiet through most of the afternoon. Whatever she was feeling, she kept contained. But by evening, she had aligned herself with her mother's version, not publicly distributing it herself yet, but no longer separate from it either. She was her mother's daughter in the ways that counted when pressure arrived. I did not post, did not defend myself publicly, did not call anyone asking for support. I logged every call, time, caller, content summary, screenshotted every message, created a folder on my phone before dinner, and labeled it Timeline. At 11:47 that night, Estelle posted to social media, no names, just careful language about betrayal, toxic attachment, and mothers who cannot release control gracefully. Everyone in our shared community understood exactly who she meant. The responses arrived within minutes. Sympathy, agreement, outrage from guests still replaying what they witnessed that morning. I read the post once, screenshotted it, added it to the folder, closed my phone. Then I sat in Raymond's chair and understood something with complete clarity. Estelle had already decided this was a war. She prepared her language, chose her audience, launched her first offensive before the venue finished clearing. And she believed she was dealing with a woman who would eventually collapse beneath public opinion. What she did not yet understand was who she had declared war against. Selah Murrell's office smelled like coffee and old files, and the particular stillness of a space where serious things get decided without being dramatized. I arrived Monday morning with the voice recording, the social media screenshot, my chronological call log, and a legal pad I had filled the night before while Raymond's chair held me together. Selah has been my attorney since Coswell was 19 years old. She does not perform concern. She listens, processes, and tells you exactly what you are looking at without softening it into something easier to carry. She listened to the recording twice without interrupting, read my notes once, folded her hands on the desk. Then she said, per line, this was never just about the marriage. I waited. She leaned back slightly in her chair. Georgia doesn't automatically hand a spouse ownership of a family business because a wedding happened. That's not how this works here, which means if Estelle understands even the basics, and I think she does, then this wasn't about immediate control. I stayed quiet. Selah tapped one finger lightly against the legal pad between us. It was about access, she said. Influence, positioning. She said it calmly, not theatrically, like someone explaining weather patterns already moving overhead. A husband doesn't have to sign over ownership for a wife to start shaping outcomes around him. It happens slowly. Conversations at home, opinions repeated often enough they stop sounding like opinions. Decisions discussed privately before they ever reach the office. She paused. I've seen businesses weakened that way without a single lawsuit ever being filed. That landed harder than anything else, she said, because it sounded real, not legal, human. Selah turned her laptop slightly and replayed one section of the apartment recording. Operational decisions need healthier boundaries after the wedding. The audio stopped. Selah looked at me over the screen. That sentence wasn't emotional. It was strategic. I felt something cold settle into place inside me then. Until that morning, I had still been viewing the apartment visit partly through the lens of pride and family tension. A controlling mother, a possessive future mother-in-law, ugly behavior wrapped in polished language. But sitting across from Selah, I understood something different. Estelle had not come to my apartment reacting emotionally to a wedding. She came prepared to establish terms. The evening clothes, the rehearsed gentleness, the repeated use of the word boundaries. None of it had been spontaneous. It was positioning disguised as concern. Salah said something else before our meeting ended that stayed with me all the way home. People think control always looks loud, she said. Most of the time, it looks reasonable right up until the damage is already done. I drove back through Southwest Atlanta, replaying the past 4 years differently than I ever had before. Every casual business question Imara asked over dinner. Every moment Estelle appeared at events or conversations that had nothing to do with her. Every subtle redirection. Every small silence from Coswell when something felt slightly off, but not large enough yet to confront directly. None of it looked dramatic, standing alone. That was the point. I pulled into my parking space and sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel. The wound was still there. I will not pretend it was not. But underneath it, something had shifted. The grief was beginning to organize itself into clarity. I was done looking at Estelle Cross as a difficult woman with boundary issues. I was finally looking at her correctly, and Estelle still believed I had not understood the game she was playing at all. Coswell's truck was already in the lot when I arrived at 7:45. I sat in my car for a moment before going inside. Not long, just enough to decide what kind of mother I was going to be when I walked through that door. The kind who asks too many questions, or the kind who shows up and lets him lead. I chose the second one. I have not always been good at it, but I have been practicing since he was 17. He was at his desk when I came in. Contractor invoices spread across the surface in the organized way he inherited from Raymond. Everything visible, nothing overlapping. He said good morning without looking up. I said good morning back and went to make coffee and did not hover. That became the shape of the weeks that followed. Coswell moved through Bassbuilt the way a man moves when he has made a private agreement with himself to keep going regardless of what it costs him. He ran every meeting, returned every call, made sound financial decisions on 3 separate contractor negotiations without asking my input. Not because he was shutting me out, but because he was using the work the way some people use water, steadying himself from the inside out. I watched the gap between the competence and the man producing it, and said nothing. There is a particular grief that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with tears or silence or visible collapse. It arrives wearing a press shirt and correct answers, and the specific discipline of someone who has decided that falling apart is not an available option. I recognized it because Raymond wore it the year his father died, and kept wearing it until one evening he simply sat down and could not explain why he was so tired. I was not going to let Coswell get that far without knowing I saw him. 3 weeks after the wedding, I stayed late reviewing property, lease renewals, and noticed his truck still in the lot at 7 in the evening. Every other vehicle gone. I locked my office, walked outside, and knocked on his window. He looked up, unlocked the door without a word. I got in the passenger side the way I used to when he was 16 and learning to drive. Close enough to be present, far enough back to let him hold the wheel. We sat without speaking for a while. The parking lot was empty. The evening had gone soft and gray around the edges. He said, "I didn't answer your message that night because I was afraid if I started talking, I'd talk myself out of it." I did not respond. He said, "I needed the quiet to be sure it was me making the decision and not the hurt." I sat with that for a long moment. His silence the night I sent the recording had sat in my chest for weeks, like something unresolved. And in 26 words, he had answered it completely. The silence was not distance. It was the same discipline Raymond used when something mattered too much for an immediate response. The decision needed to belong entirely to him, or it would not hold. He had understood that at 32, in a way, it took Raymond until 40 to learn. I did not tell him that. I just stayed until he was ready to go. He started the truck at 7:40, and I walked back to my car, drove home through Southwest Atlanta with the windows down and the evening settling around me. My son was going to be all right. But I knew as clearly as I knew anything that Estelle Cross was not finished. Coswell's grief was one front. What was building on the other front was something I had not yet seen the full shape of. The call came on a Tuesday morning from a number I did not recognize. The woman on the other end introduced herself carefully, gave her name, explained she worked in commercial real estate, and said she had looked me up because she wanted to speak to someone who would handle the information correctly without pulling Coswell into the middle of it. I appreciated that. I told her to take her time. She had been approached outside a midtown parking deck the previous afternoon. Imara had been standing near her car when she arrived back from a client meeting, not aggressively, not blocking her path, simply waiting long enough that the encounter did not feel accidental. The woman said the garage was nowhere near anything connected to Imara professionally as far as she knew. Imara asked how well she knew Coswell, how recently they had spoken, whether I had introduced them or whether they met through work. Pleasant the entire time. Calm voice, appropriate distance. The kind of conversation that feels ordinary while it is happening and unsettling 20 minutes later when you are replaying it alone at a red light, wondering why it stayed with you. I thanked her. Asked whether she would be willing to provide a written account if it became necessary. She said yes, without hesitating. I wrote down her name, the date, the location, and every detail she gave me before ending the call. Added it to the timeline folder. Kept moving. 2 weeks later, a second report came through a contractor Coswell worked with regularly along Cascade Road. His office manager mentioned noticing the same dark sedan outside the building on 2 different afternoons over the course of 10 days. Same vehicle, same general area near the curb. She could not say with certainty the driver was Imara because she never got close enough the first time to identify her clearly. The second time, she recognized the profile after seeing wedding photos circulating online months earlier and mentioned it casually to the contractor, who called me directly. No confrontation, no calls, no scenes. Just a repeated presence near places connected to Coswell's professional routine with enough consistency that people were beginning to notice it independently of one another. I called Selah that afternoon. Not casually. Formally. The way she had asked me to if the pattern continued. She listened without interrupting. Told me we were still below any meaningful legal threshold and that isolated observations were not enough on their own to support action. But she also said patterns matter when they repeat across unrelated witnesses who do not know each other and have no reason to coordinate accounts. She instructed me to keep logging everything with dates, locations, and contact information for anyone willing to document what they observed. Then she said something that stayed with me. Do not assume intent too early, she said. Just record behavior accurately and let the pattern establish itself. 3 weeks later, the pattern stopped feeling distant. I pulled into my Cascade Heights parking area on a Wednesday evening at 8:15 and noticed a dark, colored car idling across the street with the headlights off. I did not recognize it from the neighborhood, though that alone meant very little in Atlanta. Visitors parked there all the time. I drove past once before circling back naturally instead of pulling directly into my space. The car remained where it was. When I finally parked and checked my rearview mirror, the vehicle pulled away less than a minute later, not speeding off, not panicked, simply leaving with the calmness of someone who had finished waiting for whatever they came to confirm. I was still sitting in the car when my phone rang. Coswell. I answered immediately. He asked whether I was home yet. His voice sounded controlled in the particular way people sound when they are trying not to alarm you before they have all the facts. I told him I had just pulled in. Then he said a building maintenance worker from one of our Vine City properties had called him an hour earlier asking whether everything was all right between him and Imara, because she had apparently shown up asking casual questions about whether he still visited the property personally. My grip tightened around the phone. Different location, different witness, same behavior. Maybe coincidence had finally run out of room. I wrote down the time, the make, the color, and the 4 digits of the partial plate I caught when the headlights swept briefly across the curb turning out. Then I went upstairs and called Selah. She listened, asked 3 specific questions. Then she said something she had not said in any of our previous conversations. She said, "All right, Perline, we are not just documenting anymore." I wrote that down too. Leaford Gaines called on a Thursday morning and could not look me in the eye through the phone. I have known Leaford for 6 years. We closed 4 renovation agreements together without a single dispute. He is not a man who hides behind vague language. He says what he means and moves on. So when he called to pause the pending agreement on the Cascade Road property and used the word instability twice in the first 90 seconds, I understood immediately the language was borrowed. I asked him to define instability as it related to Bass-Built's actual operations. He could not. Said he had heard concerns from people he trusted and wanted to wait before committing further. I told him I understood and that the agreement would still be here when he was ready. Thanked him. Ended the call. Wrote it down. 2 days later, our accounting office received an anonymous complaint through the Better Business Bureau portal, questioning Bass-Built's contractor ethics and internal management practices. No specific accusation. No verifiable incident attached. Just enough vague language to force a formal response process and create a searchable public notation until the matter was reviewed. Selah handled the response personally within 24 hours. The complaint went nowhere. I logged it anyway. 3 days later, a woman on my property management team submitted her resignation by email. Short, polite, No explanation beyond pursuing other opportunities. When she came to collect her things, she would not meet my eyes. I did not press her. By then, I understood something important about Estelle's methods. People influenced gradually through concern and suggestion tend to defend the influence harder if they feel embarrassed for believing it. Pressing them only drives them deeper into the version they already accepted. I thanked her for her work, wished her well, and added the resignation to the log with the date and surrounding context. By Sunday, the temperature at church had shifted in the specific way that tells you conversations have been happening in rooms you were not invited into. A woman who had saved me a seat in the fourth row every Sunday for 2 years was already seated beside someone else when I arrived. She smiled when she saw me, the careful smile of someone quietly managing distance, while still deciding whether they feel justified doing it. I sat where I could find space and kept my face neutral. During announcements, one of the associate ministers briefly thanked members who continued supporting healthy family reconciliation during difficult public situations. Half the room looked forward. The other half looked nowhere at all. Estelle was not accusing me of crimes. She was doing something more durable than that. She was creating atmospheric doubt, the kind that never lands heavily enough to defend against directly because it rarely arrives as a complete statement. It arrives as concern, as hesitation, as lowered voices after your name enters the room. She understood exactly where the line was between troubling and actionable, and stayed on the safe side of it with practiced precision. I showed Coswell the full pattern that weekend: Leaford's call, the resignation, the BBB complaint, the church temperature, the timeline connecting all of it back to the weeks following Estelle's social media post. He sat with it quietly for a moment. Then he said, "She planned all of this before they ever came to your apartment." I told him I believed he was right. He nodded once, then said, "Then we don't react. We record." I looked at my son and understood Raymond's discipline had not skipped a generation after all. I went home that night and created a second folder separate from timeline: professional interference. Leaford's call became the first entry, the BBB complaint the second, the resignation the third, church observations the fourth. By the end of the month, the folder contained 6 separate incidents. Estelle had been operating for months with the confidence of a woman who believed patience belonged only to her. That confidence was her first mistake. The second mistake was still coming. She called on a Thursday evening in early October and introduced herself the way people do when they are uncertain how they will be received. Carefully, with context offered before the ask. She worked in procurement for a mid-sized logistics firm. She met Coswell twice through shared industry events and exchanged business cards with him the way professionals do, politely, without anything developing beyond occasional LinkedIn interaction. She had no personal stake in what happened at that wedding. She was calling because that afternoon, Imara had been standing outside her office building again, and it no longer felt responsible to keep dismissing the pattern as coincidence. I told her I was listening. Over the previous 2 months, she had noticed Imara 4 separate times, near locations connected to her own routine rather than Coswell's. Once near her office building, once outside a networking event in Midtown, twice in parking areas, connected to places she visited regularly after work. None of the encounters involved confrontation. That was what unsettled her most. Imara behaved like someone trying very carefully not to appear as though she was watching anything at all. The woman also received 3 text messages during that same period. The first polite, the second more probing, the third specific enough that she screenshotted it and showed it to a friend before deciding not to respond further. Then she told me about the phone call. 10 days earlier, Imara called her directly late in the evening. The woman answered through her car's Bluetooth system while driving home. But there was a slight connection delay, and Imara apparently assumed the call had gone to voicemail before the audio fully opened. So she kept talking. The woman stayed quiet and let the line run. What recorded through the dashboard system was not some perfect confession people hear in movies. Parts of it were muffled beneath road noise and turn signal clicks. A few sentences were difficult to make out clearly, but the overall tone came through without ambiguity. Probing questions about who Coswell was spending time with, whether he had mentioned me recently, whether certain women in his professional circle were still in contact with him. Not threats. Nothing explosive, but enough to establish pressure. Enough to make clear this was not a grieving woman making one emotional mistake after a breakup. There was purpose in it, direction, patience, the particular restraint of someone still trying to control a narrative that had already slipped beyond her reach. I asked whether she would be willing to provide a written statement if necessary. She said yes, without pausing. I thanked her, wrote down everything she told me with the same precision I had used since the night I created the timeline folder. Then I called Selah before 10 o'clock and relayed the full account. Selah asked 4 questions. Said she would need the screenshots, the audio file, the written statement metadata preserved exactly as collected. Then she told me to call her Monday. That weekend, I cleared my dining room table completely. I laid everything out beneath the overhead light in chronological order. The apartment recording, every screenshot from Estelle's social media post forward, every call log, every witness note, the drive-by entries with dates and partial plates, the contractor account, the resignation, the church observations, the commercial real estate woman's written statement from 2 months earlier, and now the text messages, photographs, and imperfect dashboard audio from a woman with no connection to my family and absolutely no reason to involve herself unless what she witnessed genuinely unsettled her. I stood at the edge of that table and looked at what 4 months of documentation actually resembled when assembled in one place. Not grief, not coincidence, not isolated misunderstandings unfolding independently. A pattern, sustained, coordinated, maintained with the consistency that only exists when intention exists first. Estelle operating against my professional and social standing. Imara refusing to release surveillance over the people connected to the man who left. 2 separate tracks moving in parallel. Neither accidental, neither stopping. I sat at that table until 1 in the morning. Then I organized everything by date, created a second full copy, and stored both in separate locations. I had been documenting for 4 months. I was not documenting anymore. He arrived at noon on a Sunday, carrying the particular quietness he had worn since the wedding, present, functional, and holding something just beneath the surface that he had not yet put down. I had cooked pot roast, rice, the cornbread he has eaten at this table since he was 9 years old. He sat down, served himself a reasonable plate, and ate the way a person eats when food is not what they came for. Mechanically, politely, clearing enough of it to avoid making me ask. When he pushed the plate aside, I cleared the table completely. Then I went to the bedroom and came back with both copies of the documentation and laid everything out in front of him in chronological order. I did not editorialize, did not tell him how to feel or what to conclude. I simply walked him through it from the beginning. The first call from the commercial real estate woman, the contractor's office manager report, the drive-by entries with dates and partial plates, the resignation, the church distance, Leaford's call with its borrowed language, the text messages, the photographs, and the 47 seconds of audio that a woman with no connection to our family had recorded without trying. I laid it all out, and then I sat down, and I was quiet. Coswell did not speak for a long time. He moved through the pages with the same methodical attention he brings to contractor proposals. Nothing skimmed, nothing rushed. Everything read for what it actually says, rather than what it appears to say at first contact. His hands were flat on the table when he finished. He did not look up immediately. Then he said, "The wedding wasn't the plan failing. It was the plan not working fast enough." I told him I had come to the same conclusion. He looked up then, asked how long I had been carrying this without telling him. I said I did not want to add weight to what he was already managing. He looked at me the way Raymond used to look at me when I had done something entirely reasonable that he still wished I had done differently. Not anger, not disappointment. Something more patient and more tired than either of those things. He picked up his phone. The first call was brief. He identified himself, referenced Selah's name as the referral, and confirmed an appointment for Thursday morning with an attorney who handled harassment and protective proceedings. The entire call lasted 4 minutes. He hung up and made the second call before I finished processing the first. The second was shorter. A man answered on the second ring. Coswell gave his name and said he had work that required discretion and experience with behavioral pattern documentation. The man asked 2 questions. Coswell answered both. They agreed on a meeting for Tuesday afternoon. Coswell ended the call and set his phone face down on the table. Neither of us spoke for a moment. He stayed another hour. We did not discuss the documentation again. It had been said and received, and that was sufficient. We talked about a Bass-Built contract renewal coming up in November, and whether the Mechanicsville property needed a roof assessment before winter. Normal things. Necessary things. The kind of conversation that holds 2 people together when the larger conversation has already taken everything it needs. At the door, he embraced me. The long kind, not the brief contact of a son leaving after Sunday dinner, but the kind that means something is being transferred between 2 people who do not need to name it. He walked out without telling me exactly what came next. I locked the door and stood in the quiet of my apartment. The weight was still there, but for the first time in months, it was not mine alone to carry. She had been careful for a long time, months of operating inside the space where behavior is troubling but not actionable. Social media posts without names, whispered conversations that evaporate before they can be held. Atmospheric doubt distributed through community channels that run entirely on word of mouth and trust. She knew exactly where the line was. She had stayed on the correct side of it with the practiced precision of someone who had done this before or had been advised by someone who had. Then she crossed it. A developer Bass-Built had worked with across 2 contract cycles received a forwarded text message on a Tuesday morning. The message came from Estelle. It referenced a specific bidding process connected to a Bass-Built renovation contract from the previous year. It implied that financial figures on that contract had been manipulated. It suggested the developer might want to reconsider his ongoing association with the company before whatever was coming became public. It was specific enough to be actionable and written enough to be preserved. He forwarded it to me without comment the same afternoon. I called Selah before the end of the business day and read it to her word for word. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me to send it directly to her encrypted email and come in Thursday morning. I was in her office at 9. She had printed the message and placed it in the center of her desk. She walked me through what she was looking at without rushing any of it. Georgia defamation law requires a false statement of fact, communicated to a third party in a context designed to cause harm, not an opinion. Not a vague implication spoken aloud in a corridor where no one can confirm exactly what was said. A statement. Specific enough to be measured against verifiable records. Communicated in writing to a third party with a professional relationship to the subject. Designed explicitly to cause that third party to withdraw from a business association. Estelle had met every single element. Bass-Built's financial records on the named contract cycle were clean, documented, and fully auditable going back 3 years. There was no figure manipulation. There was no irregularity of any kind. The claim was not just false, it was specifically and demonstrably false, in a way that our records could prove without ambiguity. Selah filed the defamation claim the following week. Estelle's attorney contacted Selah within 4 days, recommending early settlement. Quiet, contained, handled, before the documentation attached to the filing entered public record. It was the correct advice. Estelle declined it. She had spent months calculating that whatever I was building was nothing more than a wounded mother's collection of screenshots and hurt feelings dressed up as a legal strategy. She believed she understood the limits of what I had. She believed she would win. That overconfidence, the same overconfidence that dressed itself in evening clothes and stood in my doorway delivering terms, was the thing that put her on a path to a courtroom she could not control. Selah looked at me across the desk when we finished reviewing the filing. She said, "She finally put it in writing." I drove home through Southwest Atlanta and sat in Raymond's chair in the particular quiet of an apartment where nothing was required of me for the rest of the evening. The message was filed. The records were ready. The months of documentation that Estelle had dismissed as sentiment were now attached to a legal proceeding with her name on it. The woman who came to my door believing she had already won had just handed me everything I needed to finish this. Coswell filed on a Thursday morning, and I was not there when he did it. He had not asked me to come, and I had not offered. Some things a grown man needs to do without his mother beside him, not because she is unwelcome, but because the act needs to belong entirely to him, or it carries less weight when it lands. I understood that. I stayed at the Bass-Built office, reviewing lease renewals and waiting for my phone to show me the confirmation he promised to send when it was done. It came at 11:43. Filed. Done. The petition requested a temporary protective order naming both of us as protected parties pending a full hearing. Selah had prepared me carefully for the possibility that the judge might deny it outright, delay action until a hearing, or narrow the request significantly. Georgia judges vary widely on these filings unless the documentation shows a sustained pattern rather than isolated discomfort. What Coswell's attorney submitted was 8 months of sustained pattern. Signed witness statements from 3 independent women. Drive-by logs with dates and partial plate numbers. Time-stamped photographs placing Amara's vehicle near locations with no professional basis for repeated presence. The dashboard audio recording. The investigator's behavioral summary documenting repeated incidents across multiple locations over several months. And the original apartment recording from the night before the wedding that started all of this. 8 months of quiet work attached to a single filing. By early afternoon, the court issued a temporary order pending formal review at the next hearing date. Limited restrictions. No direct harassment. No repeated unwanted contact. No using third parties to communicate around the order. Narrower than what Coswell initially requested, but sufficient to establish that a judge believed the documentation warranted temporary intervention until the matter could be heard fully. That mattered. Not because it solved anything immediately, because it moved the situation out of whispers and into record. Amara was not at her registered address when the process server made the first attempt, or the second. The investigator's report had already noted she appeared to be staying intermittently with a relative after the defamation filing became public. The process server eventually reached her at her workplace on the 3rd attempt. It was procedure, not spectacle. The filing became public record by afternoon. By evening, I understood what public record actually means inside a community that had been absorbing Estelle's version of events for 8 months. People who accepted her narrative now had access to documentation she could not soften, redirect, or distribute selectively through trusted conversations. The material simply existed, dated, signed, specific, and attached to filings carrying consequences if intentionally falsified. Leaford called me at 4:37. He did not apologize directly. Leaford is not a man who approaches that word easily, and I did not need him to. He said he had reviewed some information and wanted to revisit the renovation agreement. I told him Selah would send updated terms by end of week, thanked him, added the call to the log, and kept moving. Estelle issued a response by early evening. A social media statement characterizing the filing as harassment from a scorned family, unwilling to accept that a relationship had ended. She used the word scorned twice. The people who had actually reviewed the filing did not find that explanation satisfying. I watched the responses beneath her statement shift slowly across the evening. Not dramatic, not explosive, simply quieter and less certain than they had been months earlier when her version moved uncontested. I sat in my apartment that night with my phone face down on the table and thought about something Raymond told me the year Coswell was born. That the woman who waits for the right moment is not passive. She is conserving. That patience is not weakness dressed in better clothes. It is strategy that has not shown its full face yet. I had been conserving for 8 months. The expenditure was just beginning. Civil cases do not move the way people expect them to. There is no single moment where everything breaks open. No dramatic confrontation across a courtroom where the truth arrives like a verdict before the verdict. It moves the way water moves through old infrastructure, steadily, without announcement, finding every crack that was always there and widening it by degrees until the structure can no longer hold what it was built to hold. Discovery requests went out in January. What came back was not one devastating document. It was an accumulation, the same way my documentation had accumulated, of forwarded messages, call records, and written communications that told a story fundamentally inconsistent with the version Estelle had been presenting to anyone willing to listen for the past 8 months. The first person to come forward was the woman who had left my property management team without meeting my eyes. She contacted Selah directly, said she had been thinking about it since the restraining order filing became public and had decided she could not stay quiet about what she knew. Estelle had reached her multiple times over several weeks before her resignation. Not once, multiple times. With specific claims about my management practices framed as insider knowledge from someone with direct access to the situation. She had believed it. She did not believe it now. She provided a written statement covering every conversation, every date she could confirm, and every specific claim Estelle had made. She signed it and submitted it without being asked twice. Her statement joined the file. Discovery pulled Estelle's direct communications with Leaford next. What those messages showed was not a concerned community member sharing honest worry. They showed a deliberate and repeated effort to introduce doubt using language that borrowed the credibility of proximity, implying knowledge she did not have, referencing specifics she could not verify, and framing it consistently as something about to surface publicly. Leaford had received 4 separate messages across 3 weeks before he called me to pause the renovation agreement. He renewed the Bass-Built contract before the discovery phase concluded. Did not discuss the messages with me directly. Did not need to. The record spoke for itself. Then Selah called me on a Wednesday afternoon in early March and told me something I had not expected. Imara had submitted a voluntary written statement. She had stopped attending meetings with Estelle's legal team weeks earlier. Selah had noted her absence through the procedural communications, but said nothing until there was something to say. What Imara provided was a first-hand account of the apartment visit. She was there. She heard everything Estelle said. She corroborated the recording from the inside, not because anyone compelled her to, but because she had made a decision about who she was willing to be when the alternative was continuing to be her mother. It was the one piece of evidence Estelle could not reframe. Every other element of the case she had an answer for. Incomplete, implausible, but present. Her own daughter's signed statement describing what happened in my apartment that night had no answer. It simply sat inside the file, telling the truth. That evening, my phone showed a message from a number I recognized. 7 words, no greeting, no ask. My mother made this worse than it had to be. I read it once, thought about Imara at 29, what she had been taught to believe, what that belief had cost her, and how completely her mother's strategy had destroyed the very thing it was designed to secure. Then I placed the phone face down on the counter and did not respond. Her restitution was not mine to give. She had already offered the only thing that mattered, her name on a document telling the truth about a night Estelle believed would never be accounted for. Estelle was running out of versions of events to offer. Everything she had built against me had been constructed on the assumption that I would not outlast her. She was wrong about that from the beginning. She was simply the last one to understand it. The gray dress has hung in my closet for 12 years. I bought it the year Raymond died, for a meeting with a developer who had decided a recently widowed woman with 3 rental units was not a serious business partner. I wore it that day and closed the agreement before lunch. I have worn it to every consequential proceeding since then. Not from superstition, but from the specific confidence of a garment that has never been in the room when things went wrong. I put it on the morning of the civil hearing and drove to the courthouse without calling anyone. Nearly 11 months had passed since the wedding by then. Depositions, discovery exchanges, mediation attempts that went nowhere, continuances requested by Estelle's legal team after additional communications surfaced during document production. The case had moved the way serious civil matters usually move, slowly, expensively, and with enough paperwork to make everyone involved tired of hearing their own names attached to it. Selah was already in the corridor when I arrived. We reviewed nothing. Everything had already been reviewed too many times to matter anymore. She simply nodded and we walked in together. Coswell was 2 rows behind me. I did not turn around to confirm it. I knew his posture the way I know my own handwriting, and I could feel him settled and present, and that was sufficient. Civil court is not built for spectacle. There are no moments where a single revelation breaks everything open and the room reacts. There is procedure. There are records read into evidence. There are written statements presented in the sequence that makes their collective meaning unavoidable. There are attorneys who make the arguments available to them, and a judge who has seen every version of every argument and is interested only in what the documentation supports. Estelle's attorney made the arguments available to him. They were not without structure. But structure is not the same as foundation, and what he was building on had been compromised long before this morning. Selah made the arguments available to her. She did not perform them. She presented them the way she presents everything, in order, without excess, letting the record carry the weight that the record had earned. Under cross-examination, Estelle's own written communications were read back to her. The forwarded text to the developer. The 4 messages to Leaford. The call records reconstructed through discovery showing the reach and repetition of her campaign. And Imara's voluntary statement, her own daughter's account of what was said in my apartment that night, entered and acknowledged without any explanation Estelle could offer that the room found credible. Her defense did not collapse from one exposed lie. It collapsed from accumulation, from repetition, from a paper trail she had not believed I was capable of building. The woman who had operated inside plausible deniability for months could not maintain that deniability once her own words were being read back to her, beside records, timelines, and witness statements collected across nearly a year. The judgment was financial, significant enough to hurt, permanent public record, not ruinous in the dramatic way television likes to imagine, but substantial enough that settlement discussions restarted almost immediately afterward regarding the remaining claims. Afterward, I gathered my documents, thanked Selah in the hallway with the specific brevity of two people who have done what they came to do. Coswell walked with me to the parking structure without speaking. In the elevator, he placed his hand briefly on my shoulder. I put my hand over his for a moment. The doors opened, and we walked to our cars. I did not look back toward the courthouse entrance. I learned later that community members who had followed the case watched Estelle exit alone. No family beside her. No victory in the way she carried herself. Just a woman in a good blouse walking to her car with the particular silence of someone who has run out of versions of events to offer. She did not lose one hearing. She lost the architecture she had spent years constructing around herself. I had already turned toward my own car before she reached hers. There was nothing left to watch. More than a year has passed since I opened that door expecting a package. I stand at the window of the same Cascade Heights apartment where two women arrived in evening clothes, believing they had already decided how my story would end. The evening light settles into the trees along the road the way it does in this part of Atlanta in the fall, turning ordinary things softer around the edges. I have lived in this apartment for 11 years. I chose it deliberately when I could have afforded something larger because Raymond always said the right space is the one that holds what matters without requiring you to fill the rest. I have never needed to fill the rest. Bass-built is intact. 11 properties intact. The operating agreement bearing Raymond's name on the foundation document and Coswell's name beside mine is intact. Nothing restructured, nothing surrendered. Nothing negotiated away slowly at a dinner table under the weight of somebody else's influence. I think about Estelle sometimes, not often and not with cruelty. Just the reflection of a woman who watched a long-running calculation finally meet its own arithmetic. The judgment did not destroy her life. Real life is rarely that theatrical, but it destabilized the thing she valued most. The appearance of authority, the community confidence, the carefully maintained image of a woman who always seemed connected to the right people and the right information. That kind of damage does not disappear quickly in Atlanta. Imara stepped away from her mother quietly and completely. I have not seen her in almost a year. Once, 3 months after the hearing, I saw her across a grocery store parking lot near Camp Creek. She saw me too. Neither of us walked toward the other. Some distances announced themselves without words. Coswell is 33 now. What those months did to him was not close him, but they left a mark. There are moments even now when his instincts arrive before his trust does. He asks more questions than he used to, reads contracts slower, watches people longer before relaxing around them. Some lessons cost too much to leave cleanly behind once you have paid for them in full. Still, he built himself back carefully. He threw himself into Bass-built through the hardest months, and the business grew because of it. Not despite the difficulty, but through the discipline the difficulty required. There is a woman in his life now. She came into it slowly and at her own pace. Several months in, she asked if she could meet me. Not to be evaluated, she told him, just to understand the family she might one day become part of. She and I had coffee at this table 3 weeks ago. She asked questions that were curious rather than positioned. She listened without calculating. She left without trying to secure anything except the conversation itself. I recognized the difference immediately. Every question Imara ever asked in this apartment had a destination. This woman's questions were simply questions. I turn from the window and my eyes settle on Raymond's chair. The armrests worn where his hands rested. The fabric I never replaced because some things should remain exactly as the person you loved left them. Not from grief, but from respect. for what carried you when life became heavier than expected. There are still nights I lock the deadbolt and pause for an extra second before walking away from the door. Not fear, not bitterness, just memory. Raymond started with 3 units and called it a foundation. He left before he could see what it became, but he left it to the right woman, and the right woman left it to the right son. And no one who walked through that door in evening clothes with a prepared speech was ever going to change that. I do not need to say, I won. The 11 properties say it. The operating agreement says it. Coswell's name beside mine on something still standing says it. Some things do not need a closing line. They just need to still be there.